Okay, so welcome to the La Chataigneraie guest speaker interviews with me, Finlay Hamilton.
And me, Ella Edwards.
So today we have the privilege of hearing from Kumi Naidoo, who is really an exceptional figure in the world of activism, having worked in sort of the two pillars of social and human rights justice and environmental or planetary justice. So Kumi is originally from South Africa and grew up deeply involved in the anti-apartheid movement. Before moving to the UK, he got a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford and was right there during the transition to democracy and the exit from apartheid with Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. So since then, he has been the Secretary General of Civicus, Director of Greenpeace, Secretary General of Amnesty International, and is currently the founding chair of Africans Rising, which works for unity, justice, peace and dignity across the continent. So now with recent political developments, it seems more and more like both of these two kind of critical elements of people and planet are, on the one hand, deteriorating, and on the other, going in diametrically opposite directions to each other. And so this is all the more reason why people like Kumi, who have incredible experience in defending the fundamental rights in both of these fields, while having the rare insight that bridges the two, are critical to hear from. So Kumi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I think it makes sense to start with the beginning, so your childhood in South Africa. What was it like growing up as a Black South African of Indian descent under the apartheid regime, and where and how did your journey into activism begin?
So my journey started at the age of 15 when I participated in a national student uprising to protest against the inequality in the education system. And, at 15, we already had a deep sense of the injustice of inequality based on race, because every time, you took a bus from your township to the center of town, as your bus traveled, you would pass white schools with 4 football fields, for example, and your school barely had 1 football field, a sports field, But it doesn't mean we understood everything, and that's one of the mistakes that people sometimes make. They feel that the only time you can get involved is you need to know everything, You can understand that is wrong and say, well, okay, I'm going to address that which is wrong, which is it's wrong for the government to spend that much on the education of a white child and this much on the education of a black child, right? So, for example, in my first march, the slogan at the front of the march was, we want equality, but the slogan got to the back of the march, the younger kids were chanting, we want the colour TV, we want the colour TV, because they thought that was the slogan at the front of the march. And as I say, at that time, I probably wanted the colour TV and equality almost equally, and both appeared equally unattainable, right? The sad thing about apartheid was it kept people apart based on race. And it wasn't simply just black and white. It was, whites were homogenized as one category. They didn't say Afrikaners in English and so on because they wanted the white community to be the largest group somehow. So they divided everybody else based on language groups like Xhosa and Zulu and so on. So you also had communities like Indian areas, colored areas, and predominantly African areas, and you lived in completely racial ghettos, right? And so once you became an activist, your main task was to break those racial boundaries, to start engaging with people from communities other than your own. And what was always a positive thing is that there were always white South Africans, even though they were in small numbers, who always were with us. Because that helped us to make a point that Nelson Mandela used to make from prison always, which was, our struggle is not against white people. Our struggle is against a brutal system of white oppression that marginalizes the majority of people in our country.
Thank you.
So, forced out of South Africa, I know you spent some time in the UK where you went to university. As teenagers with university on the horizon, it would be nice if you could talk a little bit about your studies and the role that they've played in your life. So what did you gain, for example, from your time at Oxford that you value the most? Do you still work with the university or with academia? And do you have any pointers for us as students on how to make the most of tertiary education?
Okay, so education, as Nelson Mandela said, is the biggest weapon for the oppressed and for decent people who are not oppressed, who want to make a positive difference in the world. So the more educated you can be, the more confidence you have, the more knowledge you get to make a difference. So when I was expelled from school at the age of 15, so I self-taught myself to get a school leaving certificate, and then scraped my school leaving qualification, just got enough to make it into university. Got into university and then was very busy with my activism. So I didn't necessarily get like all firsts or all A's, But somehow one of my professors pushed me to apply for the Rhodes Scholarship and a few other international scholarships, saying that, you're either going to get killed or spend a lot of time in prison. So why don't get out, get some skills so you can come back and be more useful and more productive in the struggle. And my time at Oxford was a culture shock, right? Coming, places like Oxford, which are in the global north, right? Together, they constitute less than 15% of the world's population. But when we think about how the conversations and all happen in the world, you think that that part of the world is a much higher population, right? So while I was there, I began to realize that actually the most useful thing of being here is not only taking that which you get from your curriculum and your lectures and so on, but understand that university is a place of mutual peer learning. And if I were to be blunt about it, I probably learned as much as from my fellow students from around the world, from conversations and engagements with them. I learned just as much than what I learned from the formal qualifications and so on. And so, for my sins, I should say my biggest academic achievement in the world is that I set a record at Oxford for taking the longest to ever complete a PhD. I started in '87 and I only graduated in 2000. Well, I did a few things along the way, but that's my only claim to fame that in academia. But right now, people describe me, I don't describe myself in that way because it just sounds elitist, but people describe me as a public intellectual. I am currently actually a visiting lecturer at Stanford University at the Center for Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law. I'm also a visiting scholar at Oxford University, and my college at Oxford, Magdalen College, I'm an honorary fellow there. So I still keep and I'm also a honorary professor, which means I don't get paid. So at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. So I keep those academic affiliations. Not that I spend huge amounts of time there, but the reality is, and this is one of the benefits of that piece of paper that says you have a PhD from somewhere or the other. Sad reality is, if I didn't have it, certain people in power would find it less attractive to engage with me, right? And it might very well be, and I feel very strongly that even me being appointed the head of Greenpeace and Amnesty, I feel very strongly that had I not had the PhD from Oxford and the Rhodes Scholarship and so on, probably I would not have been appointed, right? Because people on the panel who are dominated from the global north in those institutions, they want to see themselves in the people they employ. And so even though I didn't grow up in the global north, the fact that I had a degree, a PhD from what's seen as one of the best universities in the world, I think compensated for the fact that I didn't have a privileged childhood education. And maybe the last thing to say is that, education, like everything, can be fun, or it can be a drag, right? And it's up to each of us to make our educational journey exciting, thought-provoking, and something that you look forward to, rather than, to be honest, how I felt in the last days of finishing my PhD. I just wanted it to be over with.
Yeah, and just to kind of fast forward a little bit to when you were in these big activist organizations, was it kind of a challenge to move from being sort of like an individual activist, in these protest movements against the apartheid, to actually leading one of these kind of huge, bureaucratic in many ways activist organizations? What do you have to kind of make a compromise in your life doing that?
Well, that's an excellent question, and you seem to understand international NGOs quite well when you describe them as big bureaucracies. So I'll tell you a funny story. My younger brother, who's a former political prisoner in South Africa and a national student leader, at the end of my first year at Greenpeace, he sat me down and said, "Tell me exactly what you do there. What's the breakdown of your time?" So I said, "Well, I have to attend all these meetings, these internal processes, and so on." When he looked at my schedule and all the things he did, you know what he said to me? "Listen, you left home and went to Greenpeace as an activist. Please don't come back as a bureaucrat." Because it sounds most of what you're doing is all bureaucratically, defined things. But it was a challenge for me. It was also because for Greenpeace, for example, I was the first person from the Global South to lead it. And, the institutions, because of where the dominant parts of the organization are, which is all in the Global North, in reality becomes sort of structurally racist, right? Because I'll give you an example. At Greenpeace, when I joined, Luxembourg had, in the global decision making, Luxembourg had one vote. All of Africa had one vote. Yep. Belgium had one vote. India had one vote. Let's find another small. Switzerland had one vote, and China had one vote, because it's all about money, right? So the World Bank and the IMF, one of the problems with them is that they are governed on a $1 one vote system. And when I joined these institutions, that's how they were governed. We made some changes away from that, but still, the sad reality is which offices raise more money, have more influence, and it shouldn't be like that. And I hope that will change over time as things get more urgent, and our colleagues in the Global North recognize that they should be embarrassed by the fact that they have so much of power, given how small a population that they represent compared to the global population.
I'm going to go a bit off script, if that's all right.
Yeah, no.
I was wondering, what do you think are the roles of more bureaucratic activism versus individual activism, as you've played both roles? And what was the difference? How did you get involved differently in these two branches of activism?
So, firstly, I've done very little individual activism. Right? So even in apartheid South Africa, we didn't have brand name organizations like Greenpeace and Amnesty, which were known globally, but we always built organizations. We used to say, organize or starve. That was our slogan, right? And so from 15 years old, once I got expelled from school, we formed Helping Hands youth organization in my community. We connected with other youth organizations, ultimately built the South African Youth Congress. So it was never individual, but it wasn't in big global institutions, it was local. In those institutions, you can find that you have more voice, you can make decisions more quicker, and so on. With the big global organizations like Greenpeace and Amnesty, or Oxfam or Save the Children, one of the weaknesses is if you analyze how much of time is spent in internal circular discussions before a decision is made, it's indefensible. It really is indefensible, right? And that's one of the things that just, kind of suffocated me when I was there, because most of the time you were just having conversations internally when we needed to be out there communicating with the people the urgency of climate change and so on. The other thing is, all bureaucracies can be difficult, but you need a minimum bureaucracy for efficiency. So I'm not saying that all the bureaucratic elements at these institutions are, not right, but unless power is evolved to where the majority of people in the world live, we continue then to replicate the very system of inequality that we say, as Greenpeace, Amnesty, and other international NGOs, that we're standing up against, because it's like the governments and corporate sector from the global north dominates the UN and World Bank and IMF, or the business world. And then on the civil society side, you got the same thing, right? We are all supposed to be brothers and sisters, partners, and so on, but then we replicate the same kind of power dynamic, which is rather unfortunate. Let me just give you a simple example of how it manifests itself, right? So like I'd be sitting at meetings, and one of my colleagues will say, in the summer, we need to push this Arctic campaign, say, right, in X, Y, and Z ways. Now in the meeting, there's 80% of people or more from the global north and about 15% or so people from the global south. Now they're sitting there and thinking, your summer is my winter. By you saying it like that, you are saying the center of the universe is still the global north, right, where less than 15% of the world's population is. And so in that sense, the culture of the international NGOs, the big branded organizations, must change faster than it has done so far. When I was the head of Greenpeace, my predecessor at Amnesty brought his senior management team to come and visit me, and to have an exchange in Amsterdam, where I was based. And he said, I've come to realize why Greenpeace, Amnesty, Save the Children, Oxfam, and all go Greenpeace International, Save the Children International, so on. He said because they're trying to mask how un-international in reality they actually are. Having said that, on paper, the vision, mission, and so on of these institutions is on the right side of history. But if you are advocating for things at the right side of an history, but you behave in a way that is stuck in a different moment in history, right, you have a problem. And thankfully, I'm hopeful that there's enough people now in the international NGO movement are getting more courage to decentralize and to devolve power and become more looking like how the world looks like. But sadly, they have a long way to go still.
Did you want to ask something? Or?
I wasn't sure.
Okay, sure. I can. So there's kind of increasing pushback and desensitization from the climate movement as a whole. We're seeing that in Europe and in the US, at least in political circles. So how do you think we can reach ordinary, your average citizen on these issues? Do you think it will take kind of a series of major climate disasters to actually get the ball rolling in political circles?
So firstly, we are already having a spike in serious climate disasters. Even in the global north. In 2022, I don't know whether you remember, Belgium and Germany had very, very bad flooding. People died. During that time, a young man called Benjamin from Belgium, who I had met several years earlier when I visited Belgium when he was like 10 years old, writes me this most painful, email saying, he sends me a photograph to remind me, when I saw him when he was 10 years, and then he said, I was on a camping trip and I met this young girl, Rosa, and while we, in the night, suddenly we woke up and there was flooding in this place where we were camping, and I tried to save Rosa, and Rosa got washed away in the storm and died, And he set up a movement called Justice for Rosa, I think, and he had got the European Union to declare a day for victims of climate change, right? And he's now lobbying to get a global day at the UN. So it's important to note that already extreme weather events are off the charts, right? I hope that it doesn't need to get significantly worse before our political and business leaders change and embrace the urgency of the moment that we find ourselves in. However, when you ask me what needs to change in our approach, one of our weaknesses of the climate justice movement is that we have been aiming all our narratives and messages at the brain, using complicated science, 1.5 degrees, 350 parts per million, so many acronyms, you could drown in an alphabet soup, of acronyms. And what we've done is we've ignored the heart, the body, and the soul. And that is why today I spend half my time focused on building the global artivism movement, where we bring arts, culture, and activism together. So right now, to anybody who's listening to that, to this, if you have the potential to be a singer, a painter, actor, stand-up comedian, dancer, any other cultural art form, you have more power to be an active, an impactful activist than I possibly could have, because I can't sing or dance to save my butt, right? So part of it is recognizing that if we remove people on the scale that we need to read them in the hearts, not only in the brains. And sadly, some of the most right-wing and conservative and backward politicians in the world today, whether it's Donald Trump or Orban or Bolsonaro in Brazil, they don't try to move people by reaching them with rational arguments. They just go straight to the heart and just weaponize all sorts of hate, immigrants, hate immigrants, Muslims, hate Muslims, LGBTIQ, hate them, and so on. And sadly, that has actually been much more effective than one would have thought it would have been. So right now, we need to reach people where they are, not where we want them to be. Right? We might want them as activists they should understand more about climate change. Where have they been? Have they been sleeping? Blah, blah, blah. It's not their fault. It's our fault that we have not found the right way to communicate, and we need to find the way to communicate in a way that reaches people with messages they can understand, with the emotion that speaks to the urgency that we find. And if we fail to do that, I don't think we're going to win. In fact, my one line on it is, harnessing the power of arts and culture alone will not deliver our salvation from the climate crisis and the intersecting crises. However, failing to harness the power of arts and culture will almost guarantee that we lose.
Yeah. And what about kind of on this spectrum that people talk about between pessimism on one hand, optimism on the other, and then there's some people who are saying, it's a waste of time to talk about pessimism and optimism. We need to be realistic and pragmatist. So what do you think about that kind of debate when it comes to the climate movement?
Oh, being realistic and pragmatic, basically with the climate challenge, is about being optimistic. Yeah. I'll tell you why. Being realistic means we have to respect what the science told us, that we need to stay as close to 1.5 degrees, right? Being pragmatic, it's about making the transition out of fossil fuels, which is 80% plus of the cause of climate change, our addiction to oil, coal, and gas, and making the transition much faster than we are planning to do at the moment, right? So my own sense is that, in the moment of history that humanity finds itself right now, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experience, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our action, our creativity, and our sense of humanity and our sense of community. And so, you know, I understand though. I'll be lying to you if there are not days when I feel down. Like there are days I feel it's too much. You know, how do we turn things around? But I make sure that I don't get stuck in those days. Everybody has the right to have those days. I'm not saying we don't have the right. But if we get stuck in that moment, we can't do anything good with it, right? It doesn't mean being optimistic or having a sense of optimism that we're going to win. It just means that we're giving ourselves a better chance to be able to win. My son was a rapper, and he had one of his most famous songs was called Stay Shining, right? Stay Shining. And the basic message of the song was, you know, life is tough, you know, really life is tough, but actually you can be the best version of yourself if you stay shining, meaning stay positive, right? You know, whatever the challenges are, you know, don't let those in power who have brought us to this precarious moment of history that we find ourselves in, take away your right to laugh, to smile, to sing, to dance, to hope, to pray, to believe that the world we live in is not the best that humanity can create. And I refuse to accept that collectively the levels of inequality, the levels of fascism, the levels of injustice that we have is the best that humanity can create for itself.
Mm-hmm. So as a supporting partner of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, could you explain more what kind of trajectory we're on with the elimination of fossil fuels currently? And with that in mind, how does this proposed treaty work? And what kind of circumstances could we see in implementing the decrease in fossil fuels around the planet?
So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, it's quite a bloody mouthful, is inspired by previous experiences. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, the Landmine Treaty, Montreal Protocol, and so on, which address the issue of the ozone. So basically, these treaties didn't come from governments. It was ordinary people that stood up. Like say with the nuclear stuff, you had cities that were declaring themselves non-nuclear free zones and so on. And so the pressure built up from below. So the fossil fuel treaty is trying to do both. So we're building up more and more support to get what we call, you know, a fair binding agreement. And also we're talking directly to governments, top down, to get them on board. So the treaty doesn't exist. The idea is to start negotiations as soon as possible. To start negotiations, we need about 20 countries and preferably one per region. And once we start, it will be a question of if you build it, they will come. But we also don't want to have certain countries, like we wouldn't want the US to be part of it right now, because it will hold back ambition, right? So we've got the most high ambition countries, and so the first draft of that treaty, which needs to do three things. One, firstly, knowing what we know, we need an agreement that no new fresh investments in oil, coal, and gas, right? That shouldn't be too hard. Rather than invest in that, invest it in renewable energy or something else that will support your economy in a different way perhaps, but also doesn't do harm to the climate. The second thing is, we then have to, based on a country's circumstance, right, figure out the fastest phase out of fossil fuels. So let's take Colombia and Timor-Leste, which are two countries that have endorsed the treaty and are fossil fuel exporters, right? So Colombia, for example, is saying that Of course, our economy is heavily dependent on exporting fossil fuels, but we know we have to change. We know it's in the interest of our people and the world that we change, and we're going to change. But what we need to do with them then, and they've already developed $40 billion of transition plans to transition from an economy that's fossil fuel dependent to ecotourism, to renewable energy, to sustainable agriculture, and so on, so that the people employed in the fossil fuel sector can transition to decent jobs in these new industries. And then they also have to replace the income that they were earning from fossil fuel exporting by the new economies that they set up. So the third element of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, which is actually the main element, which is to ensure that the transition happens in a fair, just, and equitable way, what for shorthand we call it has to be a just and fair transition. So, for example, if you're a country that doesn't export any fossil fuels at all, but imports fossil fuels, like say Pacific Island states import diesel to power some of the electricity and so on, to get rid of that is much easier. You just put solar panels and wind energy and wave energy, and they are fossil fuels, right? But if you are a country that is exporting fossil fuels, your situation is different. So in the negotiations of the treaty, there will have to be some specificity that takes into account different countries' specific circumstances. And once we have, like with the landmine treaty, 40 countries agreed the text, and it was the high ambition countries. Once they agreed it, they took it into the UN process through the UN General Assembly. And it was very hard for people to say, no, I want landmines, I want landmines. Just like that, when we take it there, it'll be very hard for any country to say, oh, knowing now what we know, that 80% of the cause of climate change is fossil fuels, we're going to vote against it. Doesn't mean that every country needs to sign up for it to take effect. That's another thing. And like say with the landmine treaty, the US, China, and Russia have not signed it up to today, right? But what is undeniable, that once the treaty was signed, all three countries completely reduced the production, export, use of landmines. Sadly, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a rise of landmine use. Otherwise, it's not being used in conflicts, even if every country does not sign it. So that's a vision. We think that this gives us the best pathway to a more binding agreement, because for 30 years, climate negotiations have been happening at the COP and the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the full name of it. See, even the name of these things are designed almost to lock out the majority of people in the world, right? So, in fact, when the COP came to Durban, my aunt, who's worked in a sweet factory all her life as a sweet wrapper, she said, I understand there's a very big police convention happening in Durban. Who can blame her? Because all she was hearing, COP, 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 So anyway, point is, today, the reason I've thrown my weight behind the Fossil Fuel Treaty, I believe it is the most optimistic option before us. Not at all saying it's going to be easy, but we got momentum, more countries are endorsing, more countries are taking interest, and if sanity prevails, I hope that within 2 years we'll get a binding treaty. And then once you get a binding treaty, then there are legal sanctions that you can suffer if you transfer, if you violate the commitments you make in the treaty.
As there are more and more, for example, businesses, treaties, laws that are being created in groups of countries coming together as time goes on, which obviously is a very positive thing, could it be possible that in the future there becomes a point where there are too many of these grouped conventions that start to overlap with each other and headbutt their own rules and regulations that they've all sorted out, which could lead to possible consequences and more havoc in sort of like all of these rules.
What an excellent question. The answer is that could happen, and it does happen from time to time already with existing treaties and conventions, but I don't see it as an insurmountable problem. And that is why in everything I say we need to embrace intersectionality and understand how the different issues intersect with each other so that we don't have that kind of incoherence. But an excellent question and well put, I must say.
Quickly return the conversation to activism. So I'm going to be a bit cheeky right now and pull a question out of Cambridge's land economy challenge, which I think is quite pertinent to the discussion we're having now. So in this question, they sort of provide the example of Extinction Rebellion, which I assume you are familiar with. And they have a series of demands, I think one of them being to eliminate all use of fossil fuels in the UK by 2025. And I'm not sure if they've updated that demand now. But the question itself is reflecting on how government's focus is primarily on economic growth. Do you believe that environmentalist civil society organizations, so activist organizations, such as Extinction Rebellion, or in your case, Greenpeace, can be effective at pushing for governments to adopt environmental policies aimed at addressing climate and ecological crises?
Again, an excellent question, well put. So let me say this, that I am saying openly that activism has won battles, but has lost the overall war for justice, right? If it were not for activism, right, the climate struggle and many other struggles would be over now, right? The very fact that we are sitting here and having this conversation and we still have a chance, a diminishing chance, to turn things around is because of activism. But I come from a tradition of anti-colonial activism in Africa where we like to say that what's important is tell no lies and claim no easy victories, right? A good activist is not a politician, so it shouldn't be like you win a small battle here and then you make it as if you won such a big battle, right? So we have to be more humble in how we, but there's no question activism is failing. It is not winning on the scale, it's not winning fast enough, and it's not winning big enough. It is winning, it's taking too long, and the victories are too small. But just to be clear, were it not for that, we'd be in a significantly worse case, and probably even on climate, we won't be able to get out of the hole. We have a chance to get out of the hole right now because of activism with all its strengths and weaknesses. So when Extinction Rebellion put that 2025 target, it was based, and when we put these targets, we're not doing a thumb suck and saying, we think, that sounds like a good target to go for. We're responding to what the science is saying, right? So, we respect the science when the science tells us to wear seat belts because they did tests and they say, you can be safer. We use condoms because the science told us that will bring down HIV/AIDS. We respected the science to save lives during COVID, right? So bottom line is, we can't cherry pick the science. We can't say that, that science there requires not that much change and discomfort, so we'll embrace it. This science, to get off fossil fuels, which is what the science is saying you'll have to do if you're going to turn things around. That seems a bit too complicated because, the CEOs of oil, coal, and gas companies are so powerful, they control our governments and we can't do anything about it. That can't stand. That needs to be pushed back on. So having said that, it's really important that we understand that activist organizations are also run by human beings, right? They are part, And human beings bring good, bad, good experience, bad experience, good values, also some like screwed up values. And because we live in a society which is so competitive, so individualistically driven and so on, don't underestimate how those values actually kind of find resonance in all parts of society, whether it's government, whether it's business, whether it's civil society. So to expect civil society to be like completely pure and perfect and get everything right is not a good expectation, it's unrealistic. So with Extinction Rebellion, I'm a supporter of Extinction Rebellion. I've participated in activities. I got thrown out of a bank in South Africa, Standard Bank, just a year and a bit ago for taking part in a peaceful protest.
Yeah, well, sorry, just on that note, do you think civil disobedience is an effective tool for these kind of organisations?
If history teaches us anything, most of the injustices and challenges that we faced only moved forward when decent women and men stepped forward and said, enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. We're prepared to put our lives in the line if necessary. And that is what this moment calls for. However, civil disobedience is one tactic in the toolbox for the fight for justice, right? So any tactic, if you use it all the time, you use it in every context, you use it as your go-to place, it's probably not going to be as strategic as you need to be.